At this point, I'd like to get the first panel members up on stage, and please join me in welcoming Peter Donahue from the New York Daily News, who will be our moderator.
Stage right is on the left. Right is on the left, right?
Thank you.
Have fun. Hey, how are you? Okay, see you. So right here.
Thanks, man.
Missing somebody?
Okay, I'm Pete Donahue. I'm a veteran transit reporter for the New York Daily News. We don't have much time here, so if anyone recalls the McLaughlin report, I think we'll go pretty fast here and go from subject to subject, and maybe if we'll have time, we'll have some questions from the audience. Can you hear me with this? First of all, I want to talk about the transportation bill, the Grow America Act that was mentioned. The Secretary said it needs to be long-term and sustainable. I'd like to put to the panel, do you think that fits, does the bill fit that description, and why not? Or why?
Well, maybe I'll jump in. It seems to me that the big issue, here in New York and across the country is that we need the financial resources. Of course, we need reforms and how the money is spent and so forth. But we're just underinvesting in these systems. I described the current policy, national policy, as the road to ruin. I mean, that's basically where we're heading. It's not just the Green Line in Boston's third world. It's it's our entire transportation infrastructure is literally falling apart. And the president has, there's culpability all around in Washington. Paul Krugman, in his column yesterday in the Times, I think put the focus where it needs to be. And it's nice to say that there's gridlock in Washington. The problem is the Republican Party has walked away from any interest. They're opposed to any investments, any public investments in infrastructure and in transportation, which is a dramatic departure. I had lunch with Emil Frankel yesterday, who was Assistant Secretary in the Bush administration, and he's incredulous at where the Republican Party is in this thing. So that, we need to focus on that. But there's culpability at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue as well. The president has never suggested a sustainable, that's the word, sustainable financing scheme. Whether you like the Highway Trust Fund or the gas tax or not, or the National Defense Interstate Highway System, which created which didn't create, but supplemented, greatly expanded, federal funding for this thing. There was a sustainable program that lasted for 50 years. It's no longer sustainable. We need that again. And it's not about a one-time fix, with the corporate tax code or repatriating overseas earnings or that sort of thing. We need, and it probably needs to be a user fee, and it probably needs to be a gas tax or a VMT fee, or a combination of those things. But there's got to be a ramping up and a continuing and sustained commitment to investing in the infrastructure of this country.
Well, I'm glad you went to...
It's really ironic because I'd say in the Obama administration, we've probably had the two best and most thoughtful transportation secretaries in the country's history. And they're in this horrible situation in Washington where it's very, very hard to move. And, you could fault the White House over not having a gas tax increase, but it's very hard to see that happening with Congress. So, I think, they haven't talked about it, but I think it's because they feel like they can't get it. The places that are investing are places.
What about leadership? That's
I don't disagree, Bob, and I think leadership is 50% of any kind of change, and that's been true here in New York with street policy and other things. The MTA capital plan back in the 80s, absolutely. We do need leadership, but the places that are getting things done are doing it for themselves. They're raising state taxes and doing the investment. It's not a substitute, but it's the way forward right now. And they're even places like Los Angeles are raising municipal revenue.
Yeah, and we're not getting that leadership, I don't think, at the state level now. I think we can still hope for it as the MTA capital plan moves forward. But when we're hearing that there isn't really a gap and that the $32 billion plan is bloated, I think most of us would say the $32 billion plan doesn't do enough, that we've got a $1 trillion asset that we need to bring to a state of good repair and keep it that way. At the same time, we need to expand to meet, expanding demand. So it's not happening.
Now, in terms of funding, either on the state or federal level, the gas tax hasn't been changed for decades. Is it time to give that up and just say, politically, that's never going to happen, and move on? Or is that something that advocates maybe looking to Europe should push full force.
Well, the rest of the world, is continuing to depend on a gas tax, and obviously it's declining revenues, more efficient vehicles, reduced VMTs in this region, and in other urban centers around the country. Now it doesn't mean that you can't have a gas tax, but the rate has to go up. I mean, I looked at it I was on a commission that the Miller Center had at UVA a few weeks ago in Washington, and read the Clay Commission report. And it's kind of interesting what General Clay did. 3 years in a row going into the Eisenhower administration, the National Governors Association recommended eliminating the federal gas tax and returning those dollars to the states. And Lucius Clay is a very clever guy. He came forward. They originally wanted a 4-cent gas tax, which was a 2-cent increase to pay for the interstate highway system. They couldn't get it, so they went with a 1-cent increase. That doesn't sound like a lot of money, but at the time the gasoline was 18 cents a gallon, so it was 20% basically of the cost, or 25, or close to 25% of the cost of a gallon of gasoline when they went to 4 cents in '59. That would be 80 cents a gallon today. We're at 18.4 cents a gallon. I mean, that's the problem. Is that when you Google, sometimes just have a good time and Google national gas taxes just for fun, and you'll see that the highest gas taxes in the country are places like Sweden and Denmark and the United Kingdom and so forth, which is generally $2-3 a gallon. And then look for the bottom 5. It's the U.S., the United Arab Emirates, Venezuela, Iran. I mean, is that the company we want to be in? I understand we're now a petroleum exporting country again.
There's no inherent problem with the gas tax. It's the politics now is any tax is toxic, so we might as well stick with the gas tax. The problem with the gas tax is that we haven't raised it. But look, Virginia raised its gas tax. I mean, Chris Christie is talking about raising the gas tax, which tells you how bad the situation has gotten in New Jersey.
Or how bad his presidential prospects are looking at one of the other.
So,
Yeah.
So, you could replace it with a VMT fee. I think we have a good mechanism, and we should just, and some states are even indexing their gas taxes to try to take the politics out of it in the future, which, never works over the long run, but it's what we need to do.
Okay, but on the state and the federal level, whether it's the gas tax or the Grow America Act, I mean, how do you break through, the Republican wall that you described it? If you agree with that, how do you get through that logjam? I mean, you can appeal to the people. You can, those things are very tough to pull off.
Well, I've suggested that we increase the gas tax to what the public thinks the gas tax is. I think most people have no idea what the federal gas tax is. They think it's 50% of the cost of a gallon of gasoline. Well, let's not go to 50%. Let's go to 20%. Let's go something along those lines. And we're at, what are we at? About 3% or 4%, something like that. And but again, it comes back to leadership. And again, several times in American history, and again, invoking Dwight Eisenhower, I mean, the man stepped onto the south portico of the White House and proclaimed that this was something that we needed to do. And he built support for it. The Clay Commission really did their job well. They pulled in a group of business and labor leaders, highly respected individuals, and they made the case. Interesting, the arguments that they made. One was national defense. Okay, it was the National Defense Highway Act. 2 was economic growth. 3 was congestion reduction. 4 was safety. Now, those are the issues that we ought to be pushing today. The only way to compete globally is to make these investments. The only way to sustain national defense and the defense established in this country is have the GDP to underpin it. You need to make these transportation investments. The safety issue, we still have 40,000 people dying every year on the highways of this country. And it's nice to talk about just pedestrians, and we're killing lots of people on bicycles and pedestrians, but people in automobiles and so forth. And then finally, congestion is driving Americans crazy. Most Americans spend tens of hours, hundreds of hours a year sitting in traffic. And so if you went back to the American people and said, we're going to fix these things, we're going to address these problems, but you got to start with a vision. You got to start with leadership.
And if you look at the history of ballot measures that are put before Americans on these issues, our bridges are crumbling. We need a bond act. Those things pass, 2 or 3 to 1 in terms of, the success versus failure rate at American ballot boxes. Not in this region, but in the whole country. And people track those things. And when you make the case, and it's a very specific need where the money's going to go, people vote for it. Americans vote for it. So I do think with the leadership Bob's describing, very similar case in 1982, state and city leaders said, we're not going to bring the city back unless we rebuild the subway. You know, we're like $100 billion or so into that investment now.
Yep.
And, you know, it worked. You wouldn't have the city of today with the subways of 1985.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think that leadership at the state level helps inform and provoke the national conversation. I think we have to step up. You know, we need a revenue source, and it's probably something like bridge tolls. It's probably something like the Sam Schwartz plan. If we want to break out of the downward spiral that we're going to end up in.
How do you get the message across? I mean, as a transportation reporter, it's every year, every 5 years, the MTA capital plan, it's doom and gloom, doesn't have any funding, there's a huge gap. At the end of the day, it winds up getting funded. One way or the other, I mean, the MTA borrows and has borrowed. How do you get across, why is it different this time? Is this a greater urgency, a greater
Don't
emergency?
you think that system is breaking down a little bit? Even the sort of kabuki dance. Like, we've been seeing capital programs that are 3 years funded with 2 years of TBD funding now.
Right.
I mean, it's getting pretty crumbly.
Well, I think, you know, look, I guess I'm on my 5th MTA capital program, and every time we start this, everyone says it'll never happen, we can't do it, you know, it's too steep a curve and so forth, and we always do it. You know, I agree that, you know, if we're not at the end of the curve, we're getting real close to the end of it. You know, that we're close to the MTA's. I think it's 18% of their budgets now, debt service. You know, we can't go too much higher than that without putting enormous pressure on everything that the MTA does, their daily operations and so forth. So we need to find some new revenue streams. You know, I think the SAM plan, you know, for East River Bridge tolls is one way to do it. You could close the entire, you know, gap in the upcoming MTA capital program if we did that. You could go back to the stuff that Ravitch did, and there are a whole series. There are you know, several taxes and fees that nobody knows that they're paying them. And Dick always said, you know, you get them in place and then you raise them a little bit and so forth to sustain the system. And I think the users, you know, of the system have to pay as well. That there has to be, and we always end up spreading the blame, or sharing the hit to different sectors of the society. Sure. The real estate, you know, of industry, commercial real estate people need to pay a piece of it. I think City of New York needs to belly up. The City of New York, you know, Giuliani cut the city's contribution to the MTA capital program, and the city, you know, has an inordinate share of the benefits of this thing, and the city needs to belly up. But we need to do that again. But
yeah. But I think one of the ways that you get broad-based support for that and begin to change the dynamic is for the benefits of the capital plan to be more broadly shared and more quickly delivered than they've sometimes been in the past. I think the money that went into some of the mega rail projects, if we looked in, you know, I think, you know, early in this century, we thought the good times were going to go on forever, and there was a long list of rail projects that thankfully didn't get started because they would have sucked up whatever capital was left. I think bus rapid transit being described as instant transit is pretty close. It's cost effective, but it's not free. If you put a little money into it, you get a lot back. And the administration's commitment to deploy it really widely through the boroughs and to fill in the gaps in the transit system and connect people up in the outer borough neighborhoods that were maybe imagined in the 1960s to be places where people would always drive, and that's no longer the case. I think rolling out things like bus rapid transit and making it a good option for folks is going to begin to change the dynamic of public support for something like the SAM plan.
It's a great point. Even things just like painting a station and not waiting for it to come around the 30-year cycle of station rehabilitation just gives people a stake in this thing that you don't see. And we had tremendous, success with that at City DOT by doing things fast and showing people that it wasn't like a decade away and a lot of time.
Right. I mean, early on, the idea of bus rapid transit or SBS, there was a lot of cynicism about it, about people boarding without paying, at the front of the bus. So yeah, I mean that has been a big public change. And well, I wanted to ask you,
I want to just respond a little bit
Okay.
to, but I think, look, there's a place for SBS, there's a place for BRT. We're very excited about the Woodhaven Boulevard project that Polly discussed. And one of the reasons is that there are very few places in the city where we have 10 and 12 lane Baroque boulevards. Most of them, by the Grand Concourse and the Queens Boulevard, have subways underneath them. And Woodhaven Boulevard, and we have this very fine-grained street system that is very different than what you see in other BRT cities in Latin America principally, or in Europe. So we need to understand both the potential of BRT and SBS, and we need to understand the limitations. If we're going to accommodate another million New Yorkers, and again, BRT is SBS essential to filling in the gaps in the transit system and going into these transit deserts quickly and quickly, and effectively. But we need to continue to look at transit projects. We're very excited about the potential to convert underutilized rail rights of way, which is what the rest of the world is doing. Surface grade separated transit lines, that can be shared with freight services in many cases. These are cost effective. London has put $2 billion into the overground system. And has created a new circumferential network that is, for $2 billion, 500,000 passengers a day in less than 6 years. They're going for 1 million passengers a day. That's the Lexington Avenue subway for a couple $2 billion. And so I think we need to be looking at all of the modes. MTA has been very shy about putting its toe in the water with things like light rail, for example, or ferries or surface transit. And I think we need to be looking at all of those modes in addition to SBS.
There seems to be a growing recognition about real estate and how it benefits from the transit. I mean, historically, everybody knows that, but you're seeing expansion projects come on the Bloomberg administration, the funding from the real estate taxes on the west side.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how New York City or the MTA, for example, can tap into the Second Avenue subway, the Long Island project into Grand Central, and how receptive is the real estate industry to acknowledging and really committing, other than lobbying, to contributing to these needs?
Well, they're not going to lead the parade on it, I don't think. They'll probably drag their feet. But London, for example, Crossrail is being funded 1/3 by a citywide surcharge on commercial property taxes, which, by the way, London First and the Greater London Chamber helped lead the political advocacy for that thing, the business community. And then secondly, through, they call them CILs, community infrastructure levies, which are basically TIF districts, value capture districts around the stations. Many cases, in Canary Wharf, for example, the private sector is actually building the station in return for the ability to put a shopping mall. It's basically the airport model of finance.
Maybe this is the way that the city comes back to the table on transit funding.
Could be, yeah.
Because they need to set up these zoning instruments. It can't come out of nowhere like the state government or the MTA. And maybe there's even a framework around affordability that there's a transportation component to that for access. We're here talking about access. That's the way you do it. Is you bring the city. We have a great city planning commissioner who knows this stuff cold, knows the city really well, and could start thinking about this thing. It needs to be a lot more systematic. We do this on a kind of a one-off basis now in New York.
Yeah, I got to say, I think the devil's in the details around value capture. I think it's going to be every penny that can be wrung out of the value that's created by Midtown East rezoning to even, to catch up access in and out of Grand Central to a point where it won't be paralyzed by the new development that takes place. So I don't think it's by any means a panacea, and I think sometimes development creates costs that fall on the transit system.
It's not proactive.
And then we act as if we're heroes when we get a few pennies back from those developers to mitigate some of the harm.
Yeah, I
Right,
have
so
an
you're
idea.
saying your concern is that potentially you'd just be treading water. You'll be getting more riders and you'll have the same amount of crowding
Yeah,
and
it's a
conditions.
reactive policy.
You'd be
It's
treading
not-
water
it's not
and-
getting us ahead.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a
You're-
dramatic policy proposal. We could build a Second Avenue subway. Imagine that.
The man's a genius.
Yeah, and
You're ahead of your time.
Yeah, and they could help pay for it. Imagine that, right?
Yeah. But I think the concern is that not only are we treading water on some of the most capital-intensive projects, but that ties up a huge amount of agency bandwidth at MTA, at city government. The time that it takes to fine-tune these deals and make them happen is brain power and bandwidth that's being taken away from solving a lot of other problems in other parts of the city that don't get the love.
Which is why you want to do it the way John suggested, so not a series of one-offs, where it's brain surgery. In fact, that we, you create stations or you create TIF districts around Second Avenue subway stations and capture the value, and it becomes, an automatic thing as opposed to something that you have to invent the wheel each time.
Right.
That is, by the way, how the rest of the world is helping. Most places are doing this, and the systems in China and Hong Kong and Singapore and so forth are being funded largely. MTR and MRT and Hong Kong and Singapore are basically real estate companies with transit subsidiaries, and we're not going to do that. But they create enormous value, and then they capture it to help finance these investments.
So if you had to pick, each of you, if you had to pick one funding mechanism for MTA projects, let's stick with the MTA because it's the monster here. If you had to pick one to put all your political capital in, because you have to focus in this coming next 6 months, would it be the Sam Schwartz? Would it be tolling bridges? Would it be focusing on development? Would it be a gas tax? And maybe fourth, would it be increasing some of the taxes that already go to transit? If you have to pick one, and do you agree that there has to be a
You haven't
concentrated?
been spending a lot of time in Albany because nobody does just pick one.
Right, but I mean, you're going to have
pain.
a pretty focused plan, not only to convince the politicians, but Joe Ryder, right? You're not going to be able to throw a whole.
I think
soup
you
at
can split it a little bit. It needs to be not Sam's plan, but Andrew's plan. So that needs to come from the state, and that is the next thing that should happen. It's the sustainable revenue that we could put in right away. It's easy to set up. There's a plan on the shelf that could be pulled off and updated and implemented. It's all written and ready to go. And then we need the city to create that kind of framework for value capture and smart transportation linked to zoning.
And I think given the fact that we've had almost 80-cent drop in gas taxes, it would not be a terrible thing for the petroleum business tax, which funds the wholesale tax on diesel and gasoline, to be increased significantly. Nobody would even notice it.
This is the time. I mean, oil's just plunged in price recently.
Yeah.
So I think some combination of those, but the SAM plan, I agree, it needs to become the Andrew plan, but it can be. It makes a lot of sense. It's been very well thought through. I think there's a level of public support and business support that wasn't there the last time we did it because it's a different plan. It's a much more equitable approach. And I think there's real potential and that closes the entire gap.
Yeah, I think both political leaders, I think, the media has done its part but can do more to unpack for the general public how different the Sam Schwartz plan is from any of its predecessors. It lowers tolls on bridges where people have little choice but to drive. It distributes the benefits in a much more equitable way. And I think when most people hear the shorthand bridge tolls, they think back to Bloomberg's congestion pricing proposal that didn't fly because it didn't have those equity factors taken into account. So I think more needs, it's hard to unpack.
That's not why it didn't fly.
Well, there probably were some other reasons, but I think unpacking a complicated thing like how you finance transportation by taking from the places that can afford it and giving to the places that need it is a thing that needs to be more intelligible to the general public.
And you both, some of you mentioned that you think the riders have to pay. At what point is there a tipping point? I mean, the MTA has been raising fares. I did it 3 years in a row, and then they have this stated policy of every other year. I mean, does it get to a point where it's just too much for New Yorkers to afford? And is that a viable argument in the upcoming discussion?
Well, we've had a set of political principles. Let me put it that way: principles for 100 years about not having distance-based fares, for example. It's always been the great commitment of this city to the guys who've come in from men and women who come in from the farthest distances pay the same fare as the folks who do one or two stops in Midtown. I think that's a matter of high principle in this town, and that's going to be hard to overturn. We're probably not going to do that. Could we have some kind of premium fare, during rush hours on the most crowded, congested? We do it on the commuter rail system already. DC's just expanded their peak pricing in the core of the region during the peak period. We're still subsidizing investment bankers on the Lex to the tune of, probably close to $1 a ride. And
I mean, I think the tipping point is more complex than just a simple price point. I mean, you have higher fares in much of the world, but you also have a better experience in many of those
And you have lower
situations
housing
and-
costs
and
in
better-
much of the world.
Well, not all of the world,
Yeah.
but so I think the tipping point doesn't get reached as long as you're delivering some quality and people
Yeah,
see
but
that.
I think we need to get out of this business that, where we wave the bloody flag every time somebody proposes a fare increase. It's been going on for 100 years. It's really undercut the ability to invest in this system. I agree with you that if we had a higher quality service, more reliable, more frequent service, less crowded service, people would be willing to pay a modest amount. Again, with the notion that everybody's going to belly up, that the private sector is the real estate industry is going to be a part of it. The people who benefit from it in other ways are going to pay for it. The drivers are going to pay a little bit more and so forth. I think that's the kind of equation that can fly.
yeah, I think you can't take a concept like fare box ratio and compare New York to other cities, because the affordability of transit in this city underpins the ability of working class families to hang on and stay in the face of housing costs. And our transit system is what enables our real estate industry to be viable. So I think that's, and you can't take out of one pocket and put it into the other pocket and consider that you've made any progress. So I think for the folks at the bottom of the economic heap, every fare increase is a matter of life and death. Every fare increase pushes them further and further to the level of combined housing and transit costs that they really can't hang on. So I'm not saying there can never be a fare increase, but this is not kind of a pot of gold that can just be raided.
Most of the rest of the world has, again, as we move to a new fare collection system, which is something the MTA needs to do. Most of the rest of the world has social fares, where they basically have discounted fares for low-income households, for unemployed and so forth. If you're unemployed in London, you get a free pass on the underground. And another thing that other cities have done is they've differential fares between buses and transit, simply because the income levels are lower, for bus riders, for example. So why don't we give them a discount, And
We want the MTA in the social service business? I don't think so. And that's how you end up with more and more of a two-tiered system.
I didn't say that the MTA needed to pay for it. I'm just saying that, although, again, if the total revenues are in fact greater, then it may be something that we should look at as opposed to dismissing out of hand.
Yeah. I don't think we want to stigmatize any set of riders. I think the idea that if you're unemployed, you can ride around on the subway all day for free, I think would not fly here.
Only you'd get a mail-in ride pass the way other people get them, so there's no stigma involved. You'd have the same fare card that everybody else has.
Well, I think if you check back here in 24 hours, Bob and Joan will still be having this conversation. But I'm getting signals that it's time to wrap up. So I hope you found this informative, and enjoy your stay in New York.